by an executive session to be followed by a work session. It is Tuesday, August 21st, 2018, and just by way of purpose, the purpose of the work and the executive sessions on class comp this morning is to provide information and work through any issues related to cost and legal implications to the city prior to council adoption of class comp on September 5th. And we have a slightly awkward agenda today. The way this is going to play out is we're going to have a work session first to talk about the cost issues. Then we are going to go into executive session, and I'll read the statement so that we can talk about the legal issues, and then we will reconvene in work session to do an HR response and a discussion. So we'll do each of those in part. We'll start with the work session, and we have, for background and context, Director Cyrilda Summers-McGee, who's the Director of the Bureau of Human Resources, and Elizabeth Nunes is here. She is, of course, our Chief Human Resources Officer. So good morning and welcome.
How you doing?
Good.
For the record, and I'm going to turn this on because we're being recorded, correct, for video.
We're on TV as well.
We're on TV? Oh, lovely. Seriously?
Yeah, don't look if you get nervous.
Oh my gosh, my face is back there. So for the record, Cyrilda Summers-McGee, Director of Human Resources, and we're going to go through, like you said, the brief history, and Nunes, or Elizabeth Nunes, affectionately called Nunes, Manager of the Classification and Compensation Division, is going to walk us through that brief history, and then I'll jump in at the very end, okay?
Great.
So, first slide. A brief history. It has been a long time, but for most of you, sometimes difficult, but we have finally gotten to this point. It all started in the fall of 2014, and that was when we initiated the study. We went through the process, an RFP, to get a consultant to work with us. And the first thing we did was create position descriptions. Before this time, the city never had position descriptions, so there was no tool for individual employees to document their work. All we've had in the past is the generic broad class specs, which are not really a good tool for individual accomplishments, background, and a host of other things. So we started by creating those position descriptions. And of course, no employee had ever done one before, so we provided training for all employees who were involved in the study so they would know how to do it. And then they went through the process of creating a individual position description. It had to go through management up to the bureau director to get approval. And this was really important for us before going on in the study because we wanted to ensure that employees had a stake in it, that employees were involved. So in the past, I had heard, well, nobody ever asked me what I do, or my supervisor doesn't know what I do. And so to address that up front, we made everybody describe their own work, and it had to be approved up the chain of command. What that provided was an opportunity for communication so that nobody could after this say, well, my supervisor doesn't know what I do. Nor could a supervisor say, I'm not sure what they do. It provided documented evidence that everybody was on the same page and that there had been a communication. So that was the foundation for the whole rest of the study. That happened at the end of 2015. In early 2016 to 2017, in the middle, our consultants, having sent them all the position descriptions, they, using those position descriptions, created a whole new set of classification specifications. So instead of going back to what we currently have, we decided it was so old and so broken in some areas, rather than trying to fix what was not working anymore, we would just totally put it aside and start fresh. So that's what they did. That was their charge. They drafted all the new class specs, and then between June and October of 2017, we sent all those specs out for directors to review, to talk to their leadership teams. We had meetings back and forth, and we went through 2 full rounds of, okay, this is the draft that we sent. They provided input on changes, and we made those changes. Then we sent them back again and provided a second round of input. We got those back, so we were finally able to come to the final drafts by September of 2017. In that period of time, we sent all the final class specs after editing back to the consultants, and using the position descriptions that had been originally created by them, they went through and allocated or assigned all the employees into the new specs. So again, all of this was based on the original input from employees. So even though they weren't sitting there talking to the consultants at this time, it was their input, their description of work that was used to make those decisions. So by early December of 2017, we were able to send out allocation notices to all employees, which was, here's what you will be assigned to in the new structure. Again, it's all in theory, but it's letting people know in this new structure, and we published all the class specs. It's on our website, so people can check them out. They would know where they were going to go. Now, there have been a lot of questions about, well, why didn't you do the compensation then? And the answer is, we couldn't, because before you go to market, you have to know what it is you're pricing. It's like if I said, oh, I want to buy a new car, and I'm going to check out prices, but I don't know what the car is. I don't know what kind it is, what the features are. I just want to know what they cost. It's not a practical way to approach it. So once we had a steady, significant set of class specs, everybody was allocated. We went to, between January and April of this year, because the consultant services ended at the end of last year, Class Comp took on the rest of the study, which was the compensation part. And so we did our market compensation research. Between May and June, we created a new compensation structure based on the new classifications, not what we had historically, but the new descriptions of work that were broad and generic. And so we got that done by July, and now we've just been in the process of planning for the implementation, because it's going to take work. We have our information systems that have to be changed and updated, and there are a lot of other details that we need to work through. But many of those, we can't really go forward until we have the foundation passed. And we recognize there are a lot of other things that we will do to refine this, but it's a constant refinement process. That never stops. Just like once it's approved, the request for a new classification or reclassification, those are processes that always exist. So this is not the end of something. This is the beginning of a new way to manage the way that we pay people, manage the way that how we assign work, and provide a whole new set of tools to make it much easier. So just a high-level look at what we started with versus what we now have. We started with 450 non-rep classifications. We're now down to about 100. The oldest specs that we had in our collection, some of them are from the 1970s. Some of them are more current, but obviously, I know, some of us weren't even born. But now, all the class specs have been updated to describe work the way we do it now. Some of the verbiage was, word processing and things that we don't even do anymore. So they've all been updated to describe work in the current system, current technology, current way that work happens. Originally, and it's still the current system, there were 17 pay grades. There was no place for entry-level employees. It started right at the lowest classification. It was very limiting. Now we have 12 pay grades that are much broader, and the first pay grade was designed and built. Nobody's in it, but that is where we can bring people in to train them, to develop them when they don't have the experience and skills. So it's an opportunity for us to actually create those kind of programs. Before, we didn't have a way to pay them. Before the current system, we don't have any market data to defend it or show why the relationships exist between the bodies of work. Now we have a comprehensive set of data that supports the compensation as well as the different relationships that exist in the different levels. Currently, the descriptions of work are solely in the classification specs, which means some of them are super narrow and some of them you can drive a truck through. And anybody could qualify. So there's no consistency, and some of them only one person in one bureau could possibly do that work. It's not equitable, it's not balanced, and it's not defensible. With the new classification structure, the classifications are as broad as possible, and that benefits us in a whole variety of ways to grow employees, develop them. In the current structure, if you want to give an employee a new project or have them work in a different area, you have to request a reclassification because it's not in their class spec. In the new structure, there's lots of room for people to grow and develop where they are without having to go through some process. And because the pay grades are wider, a person can actually grow in their work as well as get pay increases without having to go through this huge change to a different job. They can do it within their job. And finally, currently we don't have any documentation of individuals' work, which means we don't have a record of what contributions each employee provides. All we have is this classification that is old and in some cases very inaccurate, and we have some notes on a form that requests a reclassification. That's all we have, and that's all we've been using for a long time. Now, every employee has a position description, so we know and we can manage our employees, we can work with them because we have this tool that says, okay, 50 employees might be in the same broad classification, but the difference is what makes their input special is defined in a document. And when we go to recruit, we will know, okay, this job has these very unique things about it that we need to look for. It's not just, okay, what's in the class spec. We can define it much more narrowly, and that provides a host of other opportunities. So how did we get to the compensation, which is what many people are interested in? There is a tiny list. Couldn't get them any bigger. There won't be a quiz who they are, but this is our standard market comparators. When we look at our market, it's always public sector, and we start in the Pacific Northwest. We expand out between Oregon and Washington because that is our recruitment market, generally speaking. Now, if we can't find enough comparables within that market, we certainly will go further afield. But this is the starting point of where we looked. So what everybody wants to know is, how do you build a comp structure? I've tried to make it as simple as possible. We start with defining the market, which we've already talked about. Then we have to research the market. We use the classifications as the foundation. People think that we go and match to the market based on the title, but we know that doesn't work because no matter where you go, people call things differently. So we go based on the description of the work, and we have access to most public jurisdictions' descriptions of work, and that's where we start. We research, and we find as many matches to the work as possible. We require at least 5 matches because to get a statistical accurate average, you have to have at least 5. But we prefer 10. And I can tell you in this process, there were some classifications where we have over 100 matches. So we collected as many as possible because the more data you have, the better your summary is. So we collected the data. After we collected it all, then we went to the QA process. So that entailed contacting the different jurisdictions and talking to their class comp people and saying, okay, this is what the classification says. Does that mean this or this or this? To refine the matching process, because there are a lot of things you just assume from reading it, but you don't know until you actually contact them. So we did that. Then we put together all of the pay data. And again, we had to go back and check with the jurisdictions to confirm some information. Some of them didn't have like the date that the numbers were effective. So we had to make sure that we were looking at the same time frame for the data and that the numbers were accurate. They weren't about to post something new, they just hadn't gotten around to it. After collecting all of the compensation data in with the jurisdictions from which we got it, we used a tool provided by the Economic Research Institute. It's a well-respected, accepted tool, and it will equalize the numbers for the geographic region. So let's say we had to go to Oklahoma City for a data set. We can put that into this tool, and it will tell us what does that wage equal in Portland dollars. So for anything outside of the general Portland metropolitan area, pardon me, we applied that geographic differential. So we know that we're dealing with Portland dollars. A lot of the places, because they're smaller or their cost of living is less, we know that the numbers needed to be brought up to what we have to pay. So then we sorted all the data, created levels of similar bodies of work where the minimum requirements, educational requirements were similar, level of responsibility, essential functions, decision-making authority, as well as scope and impact of those decisions. We set them on levels. Pardon me. And then we put in all the market pay data. From that, that was the foundation. Then we created a list of all of our employees currently, where they fall into the new classifications, and then where their pay is. And based on that, then we added in any union wages that are part of like a series, because we have, as an example, represented office support specialist, and they progress into the non-rep classifications. So we wanted to make sure that we were keeping in mind where the top end of represented staff was, so we wouldn't negatively impact people because they were at a higher level. All of that had to play into the bigger picture of how we distributed the money. So finally, after adding in all those elements, we created new minimums and maximums. We used the market average midpoint and then set the limits, the low, the minimum, and the high based on what our employees are actually being paid balanced with what the market says these bodies of work are paid. Jarrell? Jarrell is going to hand out to our other guests what you already have, and that is the summary document. I've spoken to most of you about it, and this is what resulted from all of that research and data compilation. And I would like to explain to you the numbers that you're looking at. Under each classification, you will see there are two numbers, a lower and a higher. The lower number represents the average minimum that our current employees are being paid that fall into that classification. The upper number is the highest that anybody in that classification is being paid currently. Now, I have to tell you, these were as of July 2nd, so some of it has changed because we have not stopped our refinement. People have, through the process, been reassigned, so this was just the initial numbers. But you can see, by looking at this, in some cases, an extreme difference in how people are paid. But this was the detail that we had to pay attention to in creating the new ranges, both the minimum and the maximum.
Could I ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
I may have misheard you. Did you say the minimum is the average minimum?
Yeah.
And the max is the actual max?
That anyone in that classification is currently being paid.
Okay, so it's an average and an actual data point,
Yes.
just to make sure I understand what the brackets are.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
minimum or the average of the people who are in that classification?
No, the average minimum.
Got it.
Because as you will recognize, there were some goals, and one of them was to produce a cost-neutral structure to deliver, which means that we needed to make sure that nobody fell below the minimum of the new range. So we had to pay attention to those numbers. We also wanted to do no harm. So we wanted to minimize the number of employees who might be at the max or even over the max. And when we concluded this, there were, out of over 1,600 employees, 11 who were over the max. And we're dealing with them on an individual basis. Other than that, the majority of employees will enjoy future growth opportunities, and no one has been harmed by this. But it won't cost a penny to initially implement.
Based on what? Why do you
Correct.
Why do you say that?
Because no one's pay has changed, no one is below the minimum, so there's no need to bring someone up to the minimum. Everybody's current pay fits here.
I'm sorry, if you're moving some people from salaried positions to hourly wages where they'll be entitled to overtime, then that does represent an increase.
And
So to define what
Yeah.
budget neutral meant, we've been a part of class comp studies that were not budget neutral, meaning upon introduction, as soon as it is rolled out, a faction of your workforce needs to be, their salary is below the minimum now, they all need to be boosted up
Right.
immediately, right? So when we say budget neutral, we don't have one employee at the City of Portland who will need an increase in their salary in order to adopt the
see.
classification and compensation study. That is what we mean by that. All right. So I actually want to go to the ongoing work. With any brand new initiative, we must identify solutions to new challenges that present themselves, right? Because it's a new project that's being brought forward. I'm going to highlight both the challenges and opportunities with this new class comp study, or that the new class comp study has created, and how we're going to proceed. I'll go into great detail in some areas, but a lower level of detail, and then we'll talk about it more when when legal comes forward. So when we did the study and we created the new position descriptions, for the first time in the city of Portland, we were able to go into detail about what is the work every individual employee is doing at the city of Portland in a way that we hadn't in the past. Our consultants were able to then compare it to FLSA, the federal standards for an exempt or non-exempt employee. With that new information, we were able to determine if employees were truly at the threshold of exempt versus non-exempt. That means that we became, the charge to HR became to go and talk to the managers whose employees had experienced a shift in their being exempt versus non-exempt, and explore, are they truly at this new level, or are they not? And then how will we proceed as a result from a management standpoint? You will need to either manage these employees differently to ensure that they work the traditional 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 with a break, 2 breaks and a lunch, or they'll have more flexibility. So that is a project that we are currently exploring, and we'll go into greater detail on where we are in that process, and a host of other details once legal comes forward. A secondary opportunity that was brought forward by many of the folks on the commission was merit increases. With our new structure, many employees who were a part of the non-rep study were red circled, meaning they couldn't get a merit increase. They were at the top of their earning potential at the city of Portland. With the change, the shifting of the ceiling for each of these new classifications, those folks who had historically been red circled are no more. So folks said, well, what's the financial implications of this shift in the structure? That made me then go and explore, how do we determine how merit increases are distributed throughout the city? Who has gotten it historically? I did a great deal of investigation. And what I unearthed was that there is a great opportunity at the city of Portland for us to actually create some structure behind how we provide merit increases across the board, not just for those who had historically been red circled, but for the entire 1,600 employees who are members of our non-rep workforce. BHR has crafted what that structure guidelines, helpful guidelines to management, what that structure could look like at the city. After speaking with many of our director peers and managers to say, how do you administer the merit increase? How does it work for you? To which most people responded, it depends on the manager, it depends on the team, and it depends on people's appetites for an argument with their workforce. Okay. Well, if we filled your tool belts with some information, would you feel more confident putting some structure around this? And they said, resoundingly, yes. So we are in the process of building that, and we will move that forward to the commissioners and the mayor soon thereafter, following this. And then the reconsider.
Not going to be part of the September 5th package?
It could be.
I think it should be.
Well, with respect, Parks already has an objective tool for that, so I would want to see.
Parks has the strongest tool out there.
How is it different?
Parks has the strongest tool, absolutely, and they've shared it with us. They have. Yes, sir. Okay. So it can be, and we should explore if there's an appetite for us to come forward with those guidelines straight away. We have developed it, and we have been talking with stakeholders along the way, so we are prepared to move that forward if you all are interested in proceeding with that. And we will share it with you.
Yeah, if you could send the drafts out, then we'd know whether it's close or not close.
Absolutely. And then the reconsideration process. The reconsideration process is always a process that has existed at the city of Portland, and it will continue to exist. So as we roll this out, there will be individuals who will feel like their classification should be at a higher level or at a different level, or we will explore that with them in great detail, as we always have at the city of Portland. So those are the ongoing projects that we are moving forward with. And if we go back a slide. But here are the opportunities of the study, the benefits of the study. we get to update a 20-year-old classification and compensation study. It's actually older than 20 years old. That's just the most tangible information that we have is of 20 years ago, but we don't even know how long it's been since we really did a holistic study, a comprehensive study of our classification and compensation structure. Will ensure market competitiveness. This new structure will allow, with 94 classifications versus 450, we can actually go out to the market on a reoccurring basis, much like we do with labor relations or with collective bargaining. Every 3 years or so, we go to the market and we do a mini class and comp study when we bargain. We can do something similar for our represented employees, so we don't have to have such an extreme shift in compensation. This also creates equity between and among peers from bureau to bureau, because historically you could have these little batches of classifications that just existed in water, where water engineers versus BES engineers, Mike and Mike, shout out to Mike and Mike. I see him nodding with me, I like it. But there can be parity. If they're doing similar engineering work or similar analyst work or coordinator work, we can make their payments commiserate with one another, in comparison to smaller bureaus feeling like they get treated differently and their classification structure looks and feels differently than the bigger bureaus. That is no more. And historically, that had truly been the case.
The engineers in parks don't get paid the same as the engineers in the utilities, and I'm assuming that's because you add 3 zeros to the utility projects. They're bigger projects, but then in some ways the parks ones are more complex because you have a lot more community input. Mm-hmm. So it's not the same across the bureaus. Similarly, the equity policy managers, even though they work together on their job description, that they have multiple different classifications.
And when you say the equity policy managers, are you saying from bureau to bureau?
Yes.
Yeah, their work varies wildly. And actually, I meet with them on every 6 weeks to talk about how their work actually differs. It differs greatly. There are some who manage entire teams and budgets. There are some who are just focused on policy. There are some that are externally focused, some that are internally focused. There literally is no classic approach to the way the city does equity work from bureau to bureau.
So, we'll first address the question about engineers in parks being paid less than engineers in the utilities.
Is that true?
I would have to go and look at who they are. Right up.
But
I
it's
don't
in the
know the
same
answer.
series. I mean, if it's in the Engineering 1 series, they're in the same pay range. If it's in the Engineering 2 series, it's in the same pay range.
Yeah, and the challenge is that the parks budget is always more constrained. So I think that's not necessarily still the case. So I think that's just an issue to flag, that it's not necessarily going to fix everything. But my second question about the equity policy managers, obviously I'm going to be taking a deep dive into that issue once I become the commissioner in charge.
Yeah.
What will be the process for changing the classifications again so that there is more parity in what they do and what they how they're compensated?
That would be a position description conversation, right? So when we look at and explore what their position descriptions are, what their work will entail, then we'll classify it according to whatever that work looks like.
So that would be another reconsideration discussion?
It would be a reconsideration discussion for sure. Any other questions? I have a few more bullets, and then I'm finished. It will provide a consistent tool for employee development and performance evaluation and succession planning. So now we have these, we have a succession plan that just a natural gradation from analyst 1 to a 2, 3, 4, supervisor, coordinator 1, 2, 3, 4. We do that series for all of the classifications where it's appropriate, where there's clearly a natural phasing up of responsibility, and that's something that did not exist historically. Historically, you would have to go to a totally different bureau, or you would have to create a brand new position or a brand new classification, which is how we got to the place of having 450 currently. And then it enables best practices in classification and compensation management, because we have more structure, a comprehensive definition of what the work entails, and a really great way to manage. When folks come and they ask us questions, we can point them to resources and articulate how and why we've made decisions. So that concludes our presentation. We are open to any further questions.
Very good. And you have a number of directors?
We do.
Okay, great.
So
we
we're,
maybe invite the directors to come and sit at the table, because I'd like this to be a conversation.
Can we go to the end of this chart?
Yes.
Because can you just, on the last item on the chart, I think I followed everything you said, but could you just left to right walk us through this one as an exemplar?
Are you referring to 64?
Yeah, 64.
Okay.
Just use this one as an example and just go left to right and tell us what you want us to get out of this.
So if you look, we'll do the comparison for the hourly rates, simply because when you go to market, public sector, they always quote things in hourly wages. So the minimum is $68.23, the maximum $109.16. And the midpoint is there simply because when you're having discussions, it's good to know mathematically where the middle is, but it doesn't have any other significance. So if you look to the three classifications that fell into that range, you will see that it's the CAO, the city attorney, police chief, and director 3. They fell into that based on a few elements. One was a comparability of level of responsibility citywide, the requirements, the minimum essential functions of those jobs, as well as the scope of decisions, how important those decisions were, how many people are impacted by it, and the size of the staff that is underneath them. And you can see except for Director 3, the current wages are shown because there's only one of them. So there's not a range, it's just where are they paid currently. And looking at those wages, you will see that they fall into the new range, but in different places, because we had to build the ranges not just as an island, but as they related to other classifications. And so the things that are before that, before the range number 64, are lower level bodies of work in the same definition. So it had to be higher than those, and there's always overlap. That's expected because when people move from one level to another, there's always some overlap. But the current pay still fits within this range, and nobody's at the very top. And so that was part of the goal. No cost to implement and to be as careful as possible, because we know wherever the top is, eventually someone will be there, but also not make it so that there's no positive impact on the employees in that grade.
Good, thank you.
Are Director 3s a subset of Bureau Directors?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
it's the highest level.
So let's just list it. That's PBOT, Water, BES,
ES, Parks.
Parks. I'm missing one. Who in here did we not list? Transportation.
Yes, you said PBOT.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's it.
We didn't bring the list, so
No.
we may be missing one. But
And,
those are for
and
sure.
the division between those is clearly defined. It's not left up to sort of a subjective reasoning.
yeah.
It's based on numerical data that we can define on a regular basis.
So many of these pay ranges are hugely broad, 67,000 to 121, that's almost double from beginning to end, 77 to 135. How will the city ensure that similar work is paid similarly with these broad ranges?
Yes. So that's actually a conversation that we're having with the city attorney from a pay equity standpoint. The way that we are providing offers to prospective employees in non-rep positions, this is not an issue for represented positions, not nearly this kind of an issue. We don't look at what the current compensation is for people who have a similar background and who are in the same classification. moving forward, we will have to be compliant with the new law. So I'll be working with my business partners. We'll be working more closely with the selection process inside bureaus, so that you are making informed decisions to understand what your current composition is, and to be able to make a compelling argument, not just an argument, but a compelling argument of why someone should be brought in above where women, men, all the protected class current employees are paid right now. So we're working very closely with Leah, and not Leah, with City Attorney's Office, Tracy and her team, to build that structure of how will HR interface with hiring managers and bureau directors to make them informed of what their workforce looks like, and when they're bringing a new person in within that classification structure that they currently have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'd like to discuss it with my colleagues later, but that doesn't.
But we
answer the
will be
question. Thank you.
compliant with the government and pay equity.
Yeah, I'm going to be asking City Attorney about that in the executive session.
Yeah. So the next phase of the process is for bureau directors to join us. Isn't that the next?
Yep.
Where's Michelle? Is that the next? Yes. Just like yes. And we invited many of the bureau directors to come forward, particularly PBOT and BES, water. Okay.
And just a time check, we have about 45 more minutes.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Observation on the class count structure. I think we should start with Stuart. You press the button most aggressively. I'm excited for it.
So I have 4 things, and they're all brief. I have a semi-sophisticated guess from my finance director on what this thing will cost over the coming year, because they're exactly correct. Today or whenever it's passed, it costs nothing. And we think that will yield about $300,000 over a year as you go through the appraisal process. In our bureau, we have 70 people that have been capped out, and so we would want to deal with that. Over time, naturally, our labor costs will go up. We have 2 or 3 issues left cooking with Cyrilda and Elizabeth. I've talked to them, and I'm confident we'll get a satisfactory conclusion to those issues in the appeals process. Really, this is not going to go away. It's never going to be done. Even in this short time period, we've created new jobs based upon regulations and so on that we have to enforce, so it doesn't go away. The last thing, the 4th thing, is kind of a plea from a bureau director. The most important thing to me right now is that we pass something. My hiring is strangled, literally. I have 2 principal engineer jobs going wanting. Principal engineer in our profession is a very big deal, and I can't hire because we are not cost competitive, or at least I can't hire what I wish to hire. So this has been a difficult and arduous process, and I think Elizabeth is going to be sainted, but she's going to have to wait till her next life. But I think we're at a good place, and I hope that council will see fit to pass this so that we can continue to march down this road. Anybody else?
Director Rebecca Esau, BDS. I echo what Mike said. The competitiveness issue is huge for BDS as well, and being able to bring in experienced engineers and attract them to the city to work here with us. We need them, and we need them yesterday. So thank you to Elizabeth Nunes and Director Summers McGee for the hard work you've done. This is a monumental task, and I hope we can get this in place as soon as possible. I also would like to see us roll out the guidelines for merit increases so there's consistency across the city, as well as some structure or guidelines for what we can offer new employees as far as compensation. So that's.
Could I ask a question, please? And your position is somewhat unique in that you hire lots of engineers. And of course, engineers are in high demand, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector. And so my question for you is, looking at these particular comp structures that have been built using public sector, our universe of competition, if you will, in the public sector, do you believe this gets you where you need to be with regard to flexibility to be able to compete with the private sector?
I believe it does, Mike.
I think the pay bands are broad enough for us to deal with it. The challenge with this, a little tale from my past life. I was a corporate VP, and I had a whole bunch of very smart people working for me, and every one of them made more money than I did. And it's all an accident of what the market was like at the time you had to hire. And so right now, we are hiring in at least for the civil and environmental engineering persuasions, we are hiring in a hot market. So I don't anticipate hiring anybody at the bottom of the pay scale, certainly not for the more senior positions. So as we think about how we go about this, we need the flexibility to negotiate probably around the midpoint, I'm betting. And that may cause some difficulty with internal staff, but it's part and parcel of our profession.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
So I'll echo most of what Mike said. Mike Jordan, Bureau of Environmental Services. I think if I can add anything for the council, I know you've heard a lot from a lot of our staff about this process and about what's going on. I think you need to know this is a good thing. And it's absolutely essential for this organization, not just BES, but across the city, for us to be competitive, for us to be an employer of choice, for us to be out in the market and touting coming to Portland to work as a professional here. So it's a really important thing for us to do. Structurally, our current system just is not tenable. My fiscal impact is very similar to Mike's. We've got about 170 non-reps in BES. About 70 of them are at top of scale. So you could imagine that the next time they come up for a performance review, there's going to be some headroom that they can get a merit increase that they haven't been getting. I can't tell you what percentage they'll actually get, but if they were to get the 4.1%, it would be roughly the same fiscal impact as the Water Bureau. Yeah.
Times 70.
And I think the last, just to echo what Mike said, we're through the reconsideration process. I think we can work out most of the issues that we've got regarding individual employees, individual classifications, and BHR has been great with us about talking our way through the Fair Labor Standard Act issues. We have a number of people who are either on call for a week, 24 hours a day, or they're working a lot of night meetings and doing a lot of public involvement work. And so we're working our way through those classifications. But to a great degree, those are legal issues. And there are parameters where you've got a little bit of flex around those criteria, but we ultimately do have to comply with that law. And I think there's some areas where it's been brought to our attention that we're not doing as good a job as we can. And so this has been a good review, I think, for the whole city regarding Fair Labor Standards Act issues.
So I'll just jump right in. Kia Selly, Portland Parks and Recreation. I want to echo what the other directors have said about the importance of moving forward with this study. We are having a lot of trouble retaining as well as attracting talent as well. We also have a need for engineers. And landscape architects and architects and the private sector, as well as other public sector organizations, are paying more and attracting talent. I might even add, we have some of our talent moving to other bureaus as well. We wish them well, but we have the more interesting projects. However, I do want to just say I'm in full support of council moving forward. We've been working closely with BHR of late, really focusing on these FLSA positions, because that has significant business and operational impacts to us. And while we want to make sure that we're following the federal guidelines, our projects can't afford some of those impacts. So we will be working closely with you and the city attorney to think about how we might actually change some of these positions so that we can really fulfill the requirements of our projects within our budgets. I want to also bring up this issue of the authority, who has the authority to approve salaries above midpoint. I think this is going to continue to be a huge challenge, as Mike was saying. And so I want to just ask for some consideration in that policy to either give that authority to a commissioner in charge or to a director, since it really does affect our bottom line. And candidly, as directors, we know that bringing in staff above midpoint is going to create some internal issues with equity. And it's also going to create opportunities for people to hit that ceiling sooner. So those issues I'm well aware of. However, right now we are in such a difficult situation with trying to bring in talent that we may need to do that from time to time. So that's just a consideration. Also, through the reconsideration process, I would also suggest that BHR consider some new approaches to looking at reconsiderations. And what I mean by that is we have many employees, as we bring in a more diverse workforce, that have different abilities around language and writing. And we do have concerns as managers and supervisors that individuals, as well as some managers and supervisors, may not be representing those jobs as well as they could. And so that remains a concern. So maybe there's an interview process. I've worked places where we've done interview processes and identified those individual barriers so that we can remove them. Thank you.
To add to that, potentially having a representative from the City Attorney's Office at those interviews to make sure we're getting all the FSLA and other equity considerations would be a good suggestion.
And before we move to the other end of the table, and not wearing my legal hat, but just as the director of the Office of the City Attorney, I also want to echo that we are very supportive of the class comp proposal in terms of, in my office, it's been incredibly difficult in the last couple of years for us to hire talented attorneys and to retain our good attorneys. And that was not historically the case, but over time we have drifted significantly down against our competitor jurisdictions, and it has now gotten to the point where it's been a serious issue in our hiring. I have actually offered positions to candidates who declined them and told me they would love to come to work for the City Attorney's Office, but not at that salary.
Thank you. Chris Warner with PBOT. I think I'll echo much of what was said. We want to move forward. We do have some issues that we're working through in terms of managers managing people that are at the same range. That's something that we're working through, and you've been very helpful with that. As far as the FLSA, in some ways that's helpful for us because we do have people that are sitting side by side. They're doing basically the same jobs. One is getting paid overtime, the other isn't. So to me, that simplifies it a little bit for us. So we're looking forward to implementing this, and thank you to Elizabeth. We went through the span of control many years ago, so I feel as though we're continuing to move on this. So I appreciate all the help that BHR is providing.
Hey, Sam Hutchison, FPDNR. A couple quick comments. One, I'm a small bureau, 17 people, and I've worked with Elizabeth and Cheryl on discussing these issues, but we had some issues with the classifications. They tend to work it's harder for small bureaus to have people go like into the analyst 3 or the analyst 4 positions, simply because we aren't large enough to hit some of the criteria. So that's frustrating that I could always lose some of my top performers who are searching for those higher positions. So it's forcing me and my staff to be extremely creative in how I can retain those people. But I do get concerned at some point I may lose people up to those higher ones, and that'll have an impact on us. The second one is your compensation for the annual review. Been private sector for 26 years before I came here. Same issue here. What we had was standard insurance I spent most of my career with. And what finally got to the point is we had tools, we had the honor system of everybody trying to making sure everybody didn't get the highest in, but everybody had an excuse for doing so. We finally had to go to it. It was your payroll budget will only increase 3% next year. Your high performers can get 5%. You figure out how to allocate that budget among your people to reward your high performers and to disincent your, well, you should be incenting, but not to overcompensate your lower performers. It's a hard thing. It was brutal. We had to go through some other processes, but we just couldn't make the tools or the honor system work the way it was. Everybody always had an excuse why their people needed to get the 5% every year.
So agree, Office of Community and Civic Life. Much of the many of the things affecting civic life has already been put on the table by other bureaus, but also FLSA, definitely for our bureau. 20% of our workforce actually is impacted by that situation. I would also lend support for the pay equity conversation, and specifically, even though we don't hire engineers, we actually have very hard to fill positions, culturally competent and multicultural, and requiring a lot of cultural community experience, and so those issues actually, even on the softer side of the work that we do as a city, impacts our hiring.
I'll echo what everyone else said. Courtney Patterson, Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. I will say that we have 3 employees who would be becoming FLSA exempt, and that would require a major reworking of some of our programs, our on-call program, and also all of our emergency activations. So definitely welcome getting that figured out prior to implementation. And also having just a conversation for the small bureaus. Each manager supervising 4 people can be difficult. So individuals who manage multiple programs that have a high risk and complexity versus a lot of people and budget.
Claudio Camposano, City Budget Office. I also will put on my small bureau hat. I think I've got my budget hat to put on in a second. But as a small bureau director, echoing a number of the things, particularly what Sam and Courtney said about the levels of it's very difficult to find folks at that level 3 in our organization. But I think that we do some of that work, and also Courtney's point about spans of control that can also affect a small bureau particularly. In terms of some of the pressures that folks have talked about regarding folks that have that are now at the top of range. If I were the leader of this organization 8 years ago, we would have faced that considerably. We had a lot of folks that had been around for quite some time and were at the top of range. I think we started managing towards this issue a couple of years ago and really started creating more of a career pathway. We did that for both sort of career growth issues, reasons, but also to be able to absorb some of the challenges that we saw coming ahead. So in some ways, we look very positively on the managerial discretion that we get out of the ranges in these, and and the fact that we can grow some folks a little bit higher will ultimately allow us some real positive impacts, 2-3 years out.
Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer. A wise person told me when I came into the city that the 3 hardest things that we do are changing vacation or sick time, people's workspaces, or their compensation. So I want to thank the BHR team, but in particular all the directors, because this has been a massive effort. You have put a lot of time into this. People have legitimate anxieties about this in the workforce, and thank you for all the investment you put into this, because I think we're getting to a good place.
So I just looked at the agenda. Following the testimony from the directors, I was going to provide my response and it is this.
Before
yes.
you
Oh, okay,
do
I'm
that,
sorry. I'm looking at the
'cause
agenda.
there's a couple of other things that we need to take care of first. So we heard a consensus, certainly on the part of the directors, for more flexibility. We heard the strong desire to have a more flexible compensation structure so that people are able to competitively recruit in a difficult market. But we have also heard hints that this is not free. And so next up, we have Josh and Claudio, who are going to talk about some of the budget implications for this. But I want to thank our directors for your participation today and your perspective on this. Just a time check, we have 26 minutes.
Claudio Campesano, City Budget Office, Interim Director. As we've heard, the immediate impact of this change would be it does not have a specific impact. It's not deterministic in that making this decision results in specific costs. However, we are expanding the ranges on these classifications, and over time, based on innumerable managerial decisions, that could result in, I wouldn't say impact, but I think we refer to it more as exposure. We could potentially have additional costs citywide, and Josh has done some, Josh Harwood, a city economist, has done some work to identify what some of what the range of that exposure might be, and he'll go through a couple of the assumptions that he's sort of put together.
Yeah,
and then sized it.
I'm happy to do that. Again, Josh Harwood, city economist. I think Claudio characterized that, and it's a really important distinction. These are not impacts, these are exposures. So it's subject to managerial decisions in all different bureaus. And so what we've done is sort of look at it a couple different ways, and I'll be kind of brief since I know we're running short on time, and happy to follow up with any office if we want to talk about it some more too. But the reality is that roughly 40% of the workforce was at top of range, maybe a little more than that, but roughly 40%. It varies pretty wildly between bureaus. And so we looked at sort of what's that exposure. And on a citywide basis, it's, let's call it $3.5 million-ish in year one. So that year one exposure, just from the people that were at top of range, if they all got 4.1% increases, it's about $3.5 million citywide. It's about 1.5 general fund. Now, when we're talking about exposure, the reason we're talking about exposure is that, and I should preface this too by saying, we should think about the general fund and non-general fund impacts of this or exposures of this very differently. The reality is that the impacts on the general fund will be determined by City Council. In other words, if you don't provide any CalTarget increases to bureaus, it will cost nothing on a general fund basis. Bureaus will have to have some management challenges. They're going to have to more actively manage that workforce. We recognize that, but from a budgetary perspective, again, if there is no increases to CalTargets, bureaus are going to have to manage within what they were going to have anyway. From a non-general fund perspective, it's a little squishier, because their reality varies wildly. If you're a rate-paying bureau or PBOT, it's going to be more dependent on that managerial discretion and their larger budget concerns. And so, both Mike's talked about that a little bit, and so did Chris. And so I think that reality will be very specific within those bureaus. But from a general fund perspective, that's sort of what we're looking at. In terms of we also looked at it in a distributional way. So if we took the existing workforce and the existing pay ranges and said, here's where people are getting paid within those ranges, took the new ranges and said, if that distribution over time holds, and that in 5, 6, 7, 10 years, what those impacts would look like. And they're quite a bit bigger, obviously, but this again is over a long haul. It's about 16 million citywide from an exposure point of view. It depends. I mean, it's just sort of a thought exercise about how many years. So how long will it take? If you assume that the distribution within those pay ranges is sort of a long run where we would be, then eventually we would get there. But it's going to be different for different jobs and different pay ranges, obviously. But it's about 16 million roughly citywide and about 6 million on the general fund side. Again, this is over a long haul.
Can you more carefully define long haul? You couldn't have come up with
shades of
16
gray.
without.
5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, how long do you think it will take for the new pay ranges to reflect the existing distributions within the existing pay ranges?
And I actually think that the question sort of speaks to an issue that we're not talking about here, which is that there is already exposure. I mean, we talk about 40% being at top of range. There's already, that means that there's 60% that are not at top of range. We're talking about the existing distribution, right? So there is exposure already with folks that would be getting merits throughout. So bureaus are already managing to that. So I think that the time frame that we're talking about is going to be the result of those innumerable managerial decisions, and that would be assuming that we achieve that same distribution of where folks are on within the ranges, which I think is really a pretty early assumption in the thought experiment.
Okay, could you dig a little deeper on the prior statement you made? If no Cal target adjustments, then no general fund impact. Be specific. What do you mean by that, and what are the implications of it?
As you know, on an annual basis, we provide general fund bureaus with Cal targets, a prescribed formula that we do. We can go into some detail with, but that includes some small factor we call drift for what essentially is merit increases. It's merit increases coupled with vacancy savings and those things that allow people to move up the pay distribution. If we don't make a specific increase to those above and beyond what we're currently doing, then our expense profile looks exactly the same. The reality is that those 40% of workers that are at top of range create some more exposure for bureaus to have to manage within. So if everybody got that 4% range in that first year, bureaus would overspend their personnel budgets.
And is there a way for you to calculate in different bureaus what the impact of that is and have it count to be towards a cut? Because in fact, when you say manage within the bureau, in fact, if they are going to be able to retain staff like we just heard from several bureaus without increasing the budget, they are going to have to cut elsewhere. So I think that something to consider would be to have that count as a cut.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess the first part of the answer is yes, we can give you that by bureau. We can give you the level of exposure by bureau.
Right. I think the flip side of that is that if we were to allocate resources to bureaus to accommodate a number that we estimate as being sort of approaching that distribution so that folks can continue the same managerial approach, we would, all things equal, then have to cut at a citywide level and face a lot of the same choices.
The challenge with the Cal, though, is that we assume that the bureaus were actively funded in the first place, and we know that they're not. And I think that one of the starkest examples is that the Parks director is going from being one of the lowest paid directors to being the top of the range, to being the Director 3. Throughout the system, Parks and other kind of, I don't know how to describe it. The bureaus that have more community engagement have tended to be able to pay less. And so as we're moving to a more citywide structure, those are the bureaus that are going to be most impacted by these changes. And it's an opportunity to create more equity for similar staff doing similar work, but without saying, well, in that case, we're going to have to cut program X.
And if I could build on that theme and maybe take it in a slightly different direction, you mentioned the issue of merit pay increases. If we are going, and we don't presume anything at a work session, but if we adopted the comp plan, it would be my assumption that we would also review the merit pay structure, because we've been using the merit pay structure to help compensate for the lack of flexibility created by the old comp class structure. And that's not a popular thing, and I just want to put that on the table, but that I think one goes with the other from my perspective.
Ask a question here. We're assuming that this is a zero-sum game after year one, but in fact, the whole conversation has been about how this puts us on a path to becoming a model employer, how we recruit and retain. So isn't there an argument here that we as a council can decide to approach this the way we did with compensation set aside or some other discussions we've had where we say we are going to set aside some money in the budget to make these changes. They are for the good of the order. We are not going to simply assume that this is a zero-sum game. I mean, the anomaly here is that we'd be saying to potentially utilities, and I understand they have a different funding model, but Mike, to the two Mikes, go out and get those engineers you need, but it's going to come at the cost of your overall staffing levels. Well, that makes absolutely no sense. That's one step forward, one step backward. So what is the comparable, what are the range of options we have if through the budget process we want to actually set some money aside in the CAL, and by the way, if you could just define CAL for our audience, set that money aside for the CAL over a 5-year or 10-year period, what are the options we have?
First, the current appropriation level is Cal targets. It basically takes the current budgeted amounts for bureaus, and this is general fund only, although non-general fund bureaus do something similar. And we add inflationary increases to those, and any special increases, like this year we'll have an increase in the statewide PERS rates that we get applied, so we'll allocate that to bureaus. It provides a baseline forecast for expenses in the city along the general fund lines. So we'll do that. The simplest option is the one you mentioned, Commissioner Fish, and that is set aside some money and compensation set aside. The difficulty, and I'm thinking off the top of my head here, so bear with me. I think the difficulty will be recognizing the need versus the want in bureaus. In other words, the degree to which right now we have a compensation set aside that is based on the current appropriation level that we set aside for the current year, that is based on their current workforce. So, and it covers the cost of living adjustments and the health benefit increases that are there. And it provides some budget flexibility in the budget year for those bureaus. Typically, the only bureaus, with a couple of exceptions, the only bureaus that use it are fire, police, and parks, are big bureaus, or big outward-facing bureaus. I would suspect if we do nothing, that more bureaus would ask for that compensation set aside in the first few years of this implementation. I mean, I think that kind of goes without question. But if we want to do something above that, we'd have to think through a little bit about about how to evaluate what bureaus really needed to do that and what bureaus simply didn't want to make any decisions and so spent and now need the money. I think that's going to be perhaps a challenge.
Well, and the good news is we've actually done some of that hard work already. I mean, at the Bureau of Environmental Services, we have council approval for a 10-year plan to staff up and get ahead of our maintenance so that we become a fully sustainable bureau. It's going to require hiring people. We are at a competitive disadvantage right now. So I think we could figure that out. When would you need some guidance? When's the earliest time you come out with some forecasts, and when would you need some guidance going into the budget season if we were to opt to set some money aside?
Again, sort of thinking off the top of my head, I think during the fall bump process. I mean, if to the extent we're making budgetary decisions, that's typically when we do Cal target increases anyway. So as part of that process, if council wants to have a more robust discussion about different ways to deal with these new compensation structures, I think that's a reasonable time to do it in advance of the first planning forecast. But Claudia looks like he wants to hit the button.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that fall bump has typically been that's budget monitoring process has typically been when we've done Cal target adjustments, and that's sort of the precedent for issuing cut or add guidance subsequent to that in November. So I think that that guidance usually is driven by a lot of the decisions that are made with regard to Cal targets. So it would be one of the drivers of whatever constraint we then need to live in.
So to be continued. Lots
Yeah.
of good conversations. I'm looking at the clock. Dan had something to say. Then I want to go to executive session.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I think it's imperative that we have criteria around merit increases adopted the same time we adopt this plan. Otherwise, you're doing an extreme disservice to our bureau directors to leave them hanging in some sort of an interim period when everybody's going to be knocking on their door saying, now that I've got a higher range, I want 4.1. And then, to the mayor's point about the merit increases, I know I asked you this once, like, nobody could tell us where 4.1 came from. It seems to be a totally random number that has taken root and become lore here. So I guess.
And we still can't.
Yeah. So
we still
I mean,
can't tell you where that came from.
So I think that's got to be on the table too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Good, thank you. Well done, and obviously the individual offices will want to continue this conversation. How brief a break? We only have 12 minutes. Okay, very good. We'll take a 2-minute recess. There she is right now. Perfect. Good. So we are now going into executive session to consult with legal counsel on the legal rights and duties the city.